SOI 1. The prank call the Sawyer family was extremely tight-knit. The parents doted on Owen and Mary, their 8.5-year-old twins. Since the day the kids were born, the parents barely made any plans without them. They weren't the type of people who needed nights out with friends. They were happy in the quiet of their own home. And it wasn't just any home. It was a mansion. Meredith, the mother, held a high-level executive position at a major multinational corporation, which provided significant financial perks. Surprisingly, she managed to balance her work and family life well, usually working from home in the afternoons while the kids did their homework. Sometimes, however, she had important events out of town. Usually, she went alone, but this time she was receiving a prestigious award, so her husband didn't hesitate to join her. They weren't sure what to do with the children. Taking them along was impossible because of school. So, they reached out to family and asked their 20-year-old niece, Nicole, to babysit. Meredith's mother, who was just around 60, would also stay with them. The four of them stayed home happily, and the parents left feeling calm, knowing the kids were in good hands. At home, after finishing their homework, they all made dinner together. They brushed their teeth, and after a short bedtime story, the children fell asleep in their beds. Grandma was tired too, so she went to bed, leaving Nicole in the living room to watch a TV series. She was totally absorbed in the plot when the landline rang. She grabbed it quickly. Hello. But on the other end, she only heard strange, heavy breathing and laughter. Thinking it was a prank call, she hung up immediately. She hit play on her show again, but barely seconds later, the phone rang a second time. She picked it up and held it to her ear. Hello. A man's voice on the other end spoke. Have you gone up to check on the children? She was still convinced it was a joke. This isn't funny. She hung up. She barely had time to set the phone back in its cradle before it rang a third time. This time, she answered, fed up. She only heard the voice say, Since you haven't gone up to check on the children, I took care of them myself. Now I'm coming for you. That last call finally terrified her. Before going upstairs to check that everything was okay, she decided to call the police. She reported the threats she was receiving. The police told her that if he called again, she should try to distract him so they would have time to trace the call. She didn't have to wait long. A few seconds later, the ringing made her hair stand on end again. Before he could start speaking, she tried to distract him with pleas and tears. She begged him to leave her alone, saying they didn't deserve anything bad. She tried to tell him a story about her family, but eventually the man hung up. Immediately, the phone rang again. She thought it was the same person, but this time it was the police. Get out of the house immediately, they said. Wynn managed to trace the calls. They are coming from the upstairs line. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, but she could only think of the little ones and her aunt and uncle who had trusted her. Without hesitating, she ran upstairs to try and save them. The police entered the house 23 minutes later. They found 4 bodies, absolutely unrecognizable. Stura 2, Island of the Doles, hi there. Before I start, I should introduce myself. My name is Sabrina, and I was born in Mexico. I wanted to tell you about something that happened to me when I was little. These are events that, even today, have no explanation. My mom passed away when I was born. This meant I was raised by my dad. He took it very hard, but he did everything possible to make sure I wanted for nothing. Honestly, I can't complain. Since he often had to work, I had to stay with my grandma, who was already quite old. When that happened, I couldn't go down to the park to play, so I learned to stay indoors without other kids and still have a good time. Then they bought me a doll and advised me to name her after my mom, Bree. That way, I'd feel like she was closer to me. At first, I hated it because at school everyone talked about their mothers, and I didn't understand that mine hadn't abandoned me and wasn't to blame for leaving. But over time, I started to grow fond of the doll. I spent my afternoons with her. We drank tea with other stuffed animals, and I told her my worries. At some point, I even started to feel like she was listening to me. One afternoon at my grandma's house, I was lying on the bed next to the doll when I saw her move her lips. I got up quickly and ran to tell my grandma, but obviously, she didn't believe me. She said I must have fallen asleep and dreamt it. However, that same night, I was sleeping there again because my dad was working. Something very strange happened. I went to bed hugging the doll like always, while my grandma tucked me in and kissed my forehead. Then I closed my eyes and started to feel dizzy. I couldn't open my eyelids, I promise you. I tried with all my strength. I didn't even have the ability to open my mouth to scream for help. I felt like I was going to die. Suddenly, I appeared in what I thought was a lake. At first, I was quite disoriented. It was night, and I could barely see until my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I followed a path that gave me a really bad vibe. At least there were torches lighting up trees that looked washed out with lifeless leaves. Underneath the trees were figures I couldn't quite make out. They looked like lumps, and I didn't want to know what they were. Suddenly, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. A doll impaled on a stake had tears of blood falling down her face. Terrified, I took off running without knowing where I was going and bumped into a sign that read the Island of the Dolls. I started crying, totally horrified. What was I doing in this place? It was a nightmare, it had to be. Please, just let it end. I could only think about my grandma coming to wake me up. I was so scared. When I turned around, I saw I was in a canal filled with water. In front of me was something I couldn't distinguish. I got closer and saw it was a tombstone with a sign next to it. I had only recently learned to read, but I was good at it. So, I read the inscriptions. It was the grave of a girl with a doll on top. The sign explained the history of that place. It said that the island, which used to be deserted, was guarded by a man who lived there alone. One day, while walking, he heard screams. He ran to see what was happening and saw a girl drowning in the canal water. Although he tried to save her, he couldn't do anything, and he never learned the little girl's identity. A few days later, he began seeing her ghost in his dreams. Every time he went out to patrol, he heard screams and crying. Supposedly, the girl was trying to torment the island's protector. Shortly after, the man found a doll in the water. It is said that it was the drowned girl's doll. Out of fear of the ghost and tormented by not having saved her, he decided to protect his house by filling it with dolls of all types and sizes. But things got worse. Dolls continued to appear floating in the water, so he decided to hang them up. Finally, the island ended up full of them, more than 100. When I was finishing reading, a noise behind me startled me. Only then did I notice there were dolls everywhere I looked. Some were missing limbs, and they all looked terrifying. Then I heard a cry that sounded like another little girl. I remembered what I had just read and got scared thinking it might be the ghost. But what if another lost girl needed my help? I breathed deeply to calm down and followed the sound. She had to be close. I recognized Bree leaning against a tree. I was so happy, so I went to give her a hug. I felt genuinely protected. However, as I got closer, I saw her face. It was black, as if it had rotted, and one of her eyes was hanging out of its socket. Then her crying transformed into a laugh that made my hair stand on end. "Bree?" I asked. I noticed something moving behind me. When I turned, I saw the dolls had surrounded me. They were approaching slowly, and I had no escape. I couldn't hold back a scream of terror as I felt my body falling to the ground and my eyes closing. I felt myself losing consciousness. I was woken up by police sirens and the lights of their cars. I remember one of them shining a flashlight in my face. I didn't know where I was. I tried to speak, but my lips wouldn't open. I was freezing and shivering. My eyes closed again, and I opened them when I felt the perfume and warmth of my grandma's hug. They had been looking for me all night. They found me several miles from her house, on some stairs in the middle of the street, with a pale face. They took me to the hospital, and I woke up the next day with my father by my side. No one could explain what had happened. The door was locked, and I hadn't made any noise, nor had anyone seen me leave. I remembered the strange dream I'd had and looked for Bree everywhere. I didn't find her. It might surprise you to know that I'm older now. I discovered that the Island of the Dolls actually exists. I went online to learn more about it, and its history was the same one I had read in the nightmare. The photos were of the exact places I had been. I told my partner everything that happened that night. I gathered my courage, and we went to visit. There, I froze when I saw that Bree was in the exact spot where I remembered her, still with her rotten head and her eye popping out. That nightmare was real. Stuarwa 3. The painting evil and madness take many forms, and you never know which one they might adopt. It isn't always a person or a creature. Sometimes we can be threatened by objects or entire buildings. This is the story of a family that didn't see the danger coming, even though it was right in front of their eyes. It all starts with a family that had to move to a new city because of the father's new job. For their home, they chose an old house on the outskirts that had been recently remodeled with every luxury. It stood out for its beautiful facade. It had spacious rooms and a well-kept garden. Although it kept that air of an old dwelling, everything seemed perfect, except for a small detail that immediately made the wife and kids feel uncomfortable. It was a huge painting hanging in the main foyer, a portrait of a noble gentleman, surely one of the house's former occupants, who stared out with a mocking and despicable smile. In one hand, he carried a hunting shotgun, and the other was raised with a closed fist. Despite his family's hesitation, the father decided to keep the painting where it was because, according to him, it gave the hallway an air of elegance. Besides, they were deep in the move, and there were still many boxes and furniture to bring in. They would deal with organizing everything later. But the next morning their plans were shattered by tragedy. Upon waking up, the husband found a terrible surprise. His wife lay dead beside him. Apparently, she had suffered a heart attack in her sleep. He hadn't noticed and couldn't do anything to help her. Plunged into shock, the family buried her and returned home without realizing that the man in the painting now had one finger on his hand extended. They tried to overcome the sadness and continue with the move. But days later, despair returned when the youngest of the family suddenly fell gravely ill and had to be hospitalized. Everything happened very fast, and the next morning, the father returned home defeated to tell his other children that their brother had died. For the first time, he glanced sideways at the painting. He didn't remember two fingers being raised. When they had barely recovered, misfortune continued to feed on the family, and the daughter died drowned in the bathtub after falling and hitting her head. In the middle of that hell, the father looked at the painting again. Now he was sure it had raised a third finger. He couldn't believe it. It was something supernatural. That being in that house were finishing them off one by one. But if he told anyone, who would believe him? Desperate, he began to drink and ended up getting fired from his job. Soon they would run out of money and have to abandon the property. He and the only son he had left would be on the street, homeless. But the house and the man in the painting weren't going to let them escape that easily. Due to his father's neglect, the boy also started getting into trouble. One day, after committing a robbery, he crashed his car while fleeing, losing his life. The father was left empty, broken inside. He had no family left, nothing to live for. And it was all because of that evil man in the painting, who was now smiling more than ever with a sinister grimace and four fingers raised. Filled with rage, the father grabbed matches and a can of gasoline, ready to burn that diabolical object. When he tried, the fire spread quickly through the whole house, but the portrait seemed to repel the flames. When the neighbors discovered the fire, they called the fire department, but it was already too late. The father had burned to death. The next day, they sifted through the rubble of the house to see if any of the family's belongings could be salvaged. Absolutely everything had been reduced to ash. The only thing they found was a huge painting with the portrait of an ancient noble ready to hunt, with his right hand raised, and all 5 fingers extended. Shadowy 4. The Street of the Lost Child. Today we travel to Mexico to bring you the legend behind the Street of the Lost Child. It was the year 1659, and Don Adrian de Villarcayo, a rich and powerful man, traveled from Europe to the Americas with his young son, Leo, after the death of his wife. When he arrived in New Spain, what we now know as Mexico, he bought a large house and hired several servants. After a year, Mr. Villarcayo was diagnosed with a rare but serious illness. But what scared him wasn't death, it was leaving his son completely alone. So, he decided to find a new wife as soon as possible. Many women presented themselves to Don Adrian, but none managed to impress him until he met Lady Elvira. The man was captivated by her, and knowing he had little time, he decided to ask for her hand in marriage 3 days after meeting her. Quickly, the woman moved in with them. However, the boy didn't feel comfortable with her. He asked his father to kick the woman out of the house, warning him that she was evil. But the man, believing it was simply difficult for the little one to accept someone taking his mother's role, encouraged him to get to know her better. Months passed, and the situation with Elvira and Leo didn't improve. They argued all the time. Being in the house became unbearable with the screaming, until finally one day everything fell silent. Something had happened. The boy had disappeared. It was night when the servants told Don Adrian they couldn't find the little one. Vilicaia told his wife that his son was missing. However, the woman barely turned to look at him, responding in a despotic and rude manner that she didn't care. Don Adrian was horrified, but at that moment, the most important thing was finding the boy. So, without wasting time, he organized a search party. Everyone went out with torches into the night, desperately shouting the child's name. Weeks passed, and Leo didn't appear. The man grew more anguished every day. However, his wife acted as if nothing had happened, walking through the streets in her expensive dresses with a perverse smile. That same afternoon, the man started to feel much worse. When the expected tragedy occurred, Don Adrian passed away without having found his son. From then on, Lady Elvira remained the sole heir to all his riches. Nevertheless, nobody liked her. Everyone blamed her for the tragedies that had happened in her house. No one went to her parties or visited her, which caused Elvira to descend into madness. Years went by like this until one day, while one of her maids was bringing her breakfast, Elvira started screaming that she hadn't killed the boy. Seconds later, after a horrible fit of insanity, the lady threw herself out the window. At that moment, a key fell to the floor. The maid grabbed it, and together with her co-workers, they went one by one through all the furniture in the house to see what the key opened. Suddenly, a door that had always remained locked opened by itself. Immediately, a horrible stench invaded the room. Inside, there was a trunk. They approached and tried the key. The object opened, and the servants let out a scream of terror. Inside was little Leo, bound and with his mouth covered by one of Lady Elvira's handkerchiefs. From then on, nobody wanted to enter that place, and the street was nicknamed the Street of the Lost Child, STORY 5. The summer camp John and his sister Carly had arrived at summer camp. She didn't want to stay there, but her parents had convinced her by offering a trip to the amusement park when they got home. The siblings, 12 and 14 years old, felt old enough to stay home alone. They felt like their parents were just getting them a babysitter. Upon arrival, the siblings had to leave their suitcases in different places. The boys slept in one zone and the girls in another. As days passed, John's impression of the camp changed a lot. There weren't just little kids, but also many guys his age and older. The counselors were pretty young, and every day they did really fun nature activities. The young man fit in very well with the group sharing his cabin. They always played games on the same team. One of his friends introduced him to Nora. That girl was, without a doubt, the most fascinating person he had ever met. It was love at first sight. She was smart, adventurous, funny, kind. Words fell short. And luckily, Nora felt the same about him, so they soon became a couple and didn't separate all day. During all this time, Carly didn't want to participate in any activity. She always said she was tired and didn't feel like it. Her brother thought she was just behaving that way because she didn't like the place and hadn't managed to connect with any of her cabin mates. However, Carly started to lose a lot of weight, so much that in a week it looked like she had lost almost 20 pounds. She was very pale and barely ate. John got angry with her and told her she had to eat, otherwise she would end up actually sick. But Carly seemed gone. She was acting very strange. The young man felt guilty for having cast her aside for his relationship with Nora. He had made his sister feel alone and sad, so he tried to spend more time with her. That was when he realized Carly wasn't faking. Something must be happening to her, because the next day she asked for a doctor to see her. They informed their parents that their daughter would be seen by a medic who would indicate if she should return home or not. When the doctor attended to the girl, He claimed she was like that due to malnutrition because she had decided not to eat. She didn't have any illness. It was a cry for attention because she wasn't comfortable in that place. Therefore, the counselors tried to encourage her to socialize with her peers and get involved in activities. However, every day Carly wasted away more and more. John, determined to find an explanation, snuck into the girls' cabin while everyone was having breakfast. He checked his sister's backpack in case she had something hidden. He even checked her bed, and suddenly something caught his attention. On the pillowcase, there were small dark spots. It looked like dried blood. He wanted a better look and noticed it was very heavy. Too heavy to be just a pillow. He grabbed some scissors and cut the case. The top feathers flew out, and suddenly John dropped the pillow from his hands with a scream. At the bottom, amidst the feathers, was a monstrous animal with hairy legs. It looked like a giant tick. It was so swollen it looked like it was going to burst. Night after night, since Carly had arrived, that creature had dug its proboscis into her temple, sucking her blood. The wound was so fine and small that on her head it was almost imperceptible. For days it had consumed his sister. You could have something like that under your pillow right now. Starway 6. The tenant living with strangers can be the best experience of your life, but also the worst. It is very important to know who you are going to share a house with before you get an unwanted surprise, like what happened to our protagonist in Bremen, Germany. Christian needed money. He couldn't cover the expenses of the house he had rented while studying abroad on his own. That's why he had the idea to rent out one of the rooms he wasn't using. He took photos of all the rooms and created accounts on several apps to promote the place. 2 days later, he woke up to a missed call from a number he didn't know. Normally, he wouldn't pay it any mind and would continue his routine. Usually it was telemarketers trying to sell a product. But this time they left a message. It was the voice of a young man asking for the price and address of the apartment to come see it. He said he was a student from another city coming to start a degree. The budget was the cheapest he had found, and it was relatively close to his university. Christian decided to contact him, and within a few minutes, they arranged a day and time for the visit. He showed up right on time. He commented that he loved the apartment. It was everything he needed. He also pointed out that privacy was very important to him, and that he didn't want anyone entering his room under any circumstances. They closed the deal, and the next month he moved into the dwelling. The living arrangement was good at first. They barely saw each other since the young man studied in the mornings and Christian had a part-time job at midday. Even so, they had dinner together and talked about how their day went. This lasted 2 months until the young man started having strange attitudes. Furthermore, a horrendous smell began wafting from his room. He was increasingly distant, no longer waited for dinner, and if they crossed paths, he didn't even say hello. Christian only spoke to him to insist that he clean his room so the smell would disappear. 3 weeks passed, and the stench didn't stop getting worse. It was unbearable, so he took advantage of the fact that his roommate hadn't arrived from the university yet to enter his room. He couldn't stand living in those conditions, much less without knowing what was producing that disgusting smell. He grabbed the knob, turned it, and slowly opened the door. It was dark, so he turned on the light. Then he saw a totally messy room. There was everything thrown on the floor. He heard something dripping, and when he looked closely at the room, he saw red liquid at the foot of the closet. He looked inside and couldn't believe what he was seeing. He found human corpses hanging in bags with what appeared to be organs. Next to them were a saw, a plate, a knife, and a bloody fork. Christian ran out of there. He had to go to the police station as soon as possible. The elevator door opened while he was waiting, and he ran straight into the supposed student. After a brief greeting without looking him in the eye, the student entered and pressed the button. The killer would arrive at the apartment and find the closet open and the light on. Christian didn't have much time. When the police arrived, the room was a reflection of what the landlord had described. Nothing was missing, except the sadistic killer. They never found him, and nobody heard anything more about him. He may have changed countries and identities, and he might also be in another person's house who still doesn't know who they are sharing a roof with. Shadowy 7. The confession: we're traveling to Mexico to bring you a legend from the center of the capital. It was a dark but quiet night, in which Father Augustine Aparicio was heading to a meeting with some of his parishioners and friends. In the area, everyone knew him as a preacher of the Word of God, and when they met him, they kissed his hand and promised to donate things to the poor. That's why his walk took longer than normal. The street was narrow and cobbled. There was no light other than the little reflected by the moon. He was thinking about the meeting with his friends. After a long day, he wanted to disconnect. Usually, they played cards and even bet a little something, but they were often interrupted by the pleas of neighbors. He kept walking, and suddenly he heard the footsteps of someone following him. He had already crossed through the busiest streets. It was weird for someone to follow him so closely and hurriedly. He didn't look back in case it was a thug wanting attention, so he continued with a firm step toward his destination. But soon, his doubts were cleared up. A man's voice called him. "Father, excuse me." He turned his head and saw two anguished young men. He responded by asking what was happening, and then they told him there was a dying woman nearby who wished to confess. He had never seen these young men, but without making any excuses, the priest agreed and asked them to hurry. They helped him up onto a carriage that was waiting for them and instructed the driver to take them to that woman's house. They traveled several streets, and upon arriving at their destination, they helped the father down and knocked on the door. A short lady, disheveled and with her face lowered, opened it. She was carrying a lit candle, and the clothes she wore were very old. Within a few seconds, the priest detected a nauseating smell in that house, difficult to bear, but he concentrated on his work, and the woman led him to the room where the dying woman was. Before entering, the old woman gave the candle to the father and left him alone. Inside the room, he found a woman lying on the bed. She wore a very luxurious velvet dress and a diamond tiara on her head. Everything was full of beautiful embroidery. However, what stood out most was the beauty of her face and the blonde hair spread over the pillow. She was crying and asked the father to come closer. He did so, and very slowly took out his rosary and his white handkerchief. The confession began, and he felt true pity for the dying woman. The woman suffered greatly telling him her sins. She could barely be understood because she wouldn't stop sobbing. Seeing her suffering, a few tears even escaped the father. But time passed, and little by little, she seemed calmer and more resigned. The father freed her from all sin, giving her absolution, and said goodbye to her with a kiss. But as he did, he noticed something terrible. That woman was already dead. He called the lady who had opened the door to give her the terrible news, but no one answered. So he left the room and searched the rest of the rooms. He didn't see anyone, and that was when he decided to go out to the street to look for the boys who had alerted him, but they weren't anywhere either. He wanted to return inside the house, but when he reached the door, it started to creak as it closed. He tried to keep it open, but he couldn't. That force wasn't normal. He had never seen anything like it. Furthermore, right after it closed completely, a terrible shriek was heard coming from inside. He was totally rattled. He didn't understand anything. Scared, he withdrew from the place to meet up with his friends. By now, they must be worried. He picked up his pace as much as he could. The streets were dark and very lonely. He entered the house where the meeting was being held, pale and with his face distorted by fright. Some of those present started asking what was wrong, while others just joked that he had crapped himself from fear of losing his bets. He stood in silence for a while, trying to recover under the attentive gaze of his friends. Sweat poured down his forehead. He had made the return journey almost running, so he reached into his pocket to take out something to dry off. And that's when he realized the white handkerchief and the rosary he used in that house had disappeared. That was when he told his friends what happened. Since they cared for him a lot, they told him not to worry. They would send some young men to recover the objects he had forgotten. He accepted, although he kept turning the matter over in his mind, because he was sure he had put them away. When the boys arrived at the place, they knocked, but no one answered. Plus, the house looked abandoned. They asked the neighbors, but everyone said they knew nothing, so they decided to return. Upon returning to the meeting, they wanted to confirm the address of the place in case they had made a mistake. But the father insisted it was correct, and they saw him so affected that they decided they would all go back together the next day. As soon as the sun rose, they returned to the place indicated by the priest, but again, after insisting several times, no one opened the door. The father was totally bewildered. He was sure that was the house he had visited, but now it looked different. While they were at the entrance, a neighbor appeared, an elderly gentleman. He warned them that no one would open. No one had lived there for years. He also told them that years ago, noises were heard on the property. His wife went to the window to check that everything was in order. Terrified, she saw the house in flames and inside, a woman dressed in velvet. Apparently, she ran from one side to the other emitting shrieks of pain. The fire was already at chest height. Due to the shock, his wife was never the same again. She fell ill and finally died. Despite hearing the sad story, the father kept insisting on entering the residence, so they sent for a locksmith to open the door. Effectively, there was no one inside. The house was practically in ruins, but even so, they could confirm the priest's version when, in one of the rooms, they found the rosary and the handkerchief thrown on the floor. Furthermore, they stumbled upon something even more unpleasant. The rotting corpse of a woman with various parts of her body burned who, just as the priest had indicated, was wearing a velvet dress and a diamond tiara. A shiver ran through the bodies of those present as they began to hear murmurs. It was Father Augustine, who wouldn't stop praying. They observed him carefully and discovered that his eyes had a strange color and strange foam was coming out of his mouth. Shortly after, he collapsed on the floor. He had died. Story 8. The gravedigger. It all started with the arrival of Peter, the new gravedigger at a cemetery in Madrid. The previous one had disappeared 2 days earlier. No one knew where he was, and he hadn't left any clues. And although the investigation was ongoing, someone had to replace him quickly. As soon as he arrived, he found a large number of graves to dig. They were 8 hours behind the time they had been without staff. It was the first time he had been hired, so it wasn't a problem. He was excited to earn some money. A few days later, he realized an old man was watching him while he worked. He didn't give it any importance and continued. He figured he was just walking around and had nothing better to do. But time passed. He was already on his 4th hole, and that gentleman was still behind him. Uncomfortable, he turned around and asked if he needed something. Then the man started to cry. His answer was that he knew he had little time left to live and wanted to see the graves before passing away. One of them would be his. The gravedigger felt compassion for that poor man and told him he would dig a special one. He promised he would make sure they didn't use it for anyone else. Grateful, the old man asked the favor that it be quite far from the others so he could rest in peace. He said he had a place in mind and guided Peter there. Peter got to work while the man continued watching him. He hadn't stopped crying at any moment, although it didn't bother Peter. However, when the hole was perfectly defined, like a niche, his crying rose so loud it sounded like a baby. It was very unpleasant. After a long while, he asked for the shovel. He said he felt he should be the one to remove the last piles of dirt. His physique seemed too frail, but Peter had had a few intense days and thought a break would be good for him. He stepped away from the excavation to find somewhere to sit. Then he heard the old man scream. Hurriedly, he went to see what was happening. He had found a decomposing corpse, and from what they had told him, it fit perfectly with the old gravedigger. Suddenly, the tears dried up, and a smile appeared behind the man's lips. He grabbed the shovel, hit Peter on the back of the head, and threw him into the hole. From the bottom, he could see dirt falling on him just before closing his eyes and dying. This same thing has happened in more cemeteries across the country. Only they have managed to see the old man without knowing what it meant, a sign of their impending death. Who or what is that gentleman? Story 9. The executioners a long time ago, 2 great friends, Turner and Sanders, had an argument. Both worked as executioners and had to kill those condemned to death. Normally, they didn't enjoy doing it, but that day was special. It involved a man known throughout the country for his large number of crimes and murders. Because of this, the executioners were interested in being the one to give him what he deserved. Turner played dirty to be the hero who executed the criminal and lied about Sanders' sins, accusing him of plotting a plan to assassinate the king. He managed to get the latter imprisoned and kept the job for himself. Once he beheaded the condemned man, he went down to the cell to free his friend, but Sanders had taken his own life. He observed the room. He discovered that before dying, Sanders wrote on the wall with his blood, "I will return to get revenge." Since then, Turner couldn't spend a night without dreaming of his old partner. He had the image of Sanders fixed in his subconscious, locked behind bars while bleeding out. A few years later, eaten by guilt, he decided to visit him at the cemetery. He knelt before Sanders' tombstone and began to cry and pray for his soul. But repentance wasn't enough, because upon getting up to return to his house, he heard the voice of the deceased telling him that his child was going to die because of his lie. However, he didn't have any descendants, so he thought it had been a hallucination. Suddenly, a skeletal hand came out of the earth. He stood perplexed, staring at it while the rest of the skeleton continued emerging. He was sure it was his old friend. He ran toward his home, scared, and as soon as he arrived, he saw his wife crying with happiness. She gave him the news that she was pregnant. At that moment, he remembered what Sanders had told him at the grave. He felt panic for the first time in his life and understood what was about to happen. He locked the door and forced his wife to lock herself in the bedroom without giving her explanations. Turner was in the entrance gripping his axe and waiting for the skeleton when he heard his beloved scream. He arrived quickly at her room and found her cornered while Sanders approached her. He attacked the skeleton from behind, however. He didn't even put a scratch on it, and witnessed how it stabbed the pregnant woman's belly with its bony fingers. She began to bleed until she fell to the floor dead. Sanders hit the pile of bones again with his eyes closed. When he opened them, he saw his axe stuck in his wife's belly. Sisto RY10. So as those of you who live in an apartment building know how annoying a bad neighbor can be. Hearing noises at all hours is torture, especially at night. And asking yourself what they must be doing to make that racket. Well, sometimes it's better not to know, like what happened to our protagonist. When she was young, Martha went to the capital to study at the university. Although at first she was a bit scared, since she had spent her whole life in a small town, she got used to the big city right away. In fact, she loved getting lost in the crowd and the freedom of walking down the street without anyone recognizing her. Shortly after, she wanted to leave the student residence where she lived and move to a building on the outskirts. She found a simple apartment with just enough comforts, but very cozy, especially for the price she could pay. It was the typical old construction with a multitude of identical apartments, occupied mostly by single young people or solitary folks. What attracted her most was that the place seemed very quiet. You didn't see large families making noise or loud kids running up the stairs, so she thought she'd be comfortable there. But you don't know a neighborhood until you've lived there a while, and a few weeks later, the problems started appearing. Being an old building, the plumbing and basic services failed constantly. Many times she had to shower in cold water, and the elevator broke down almost every month, although she preferred using the stairs to getting into that small space with her neighbors. There were some who looked pretty bad. They seemed like they were taken out of a horror movie. Among them, one gave her a very bad vibe, specifically the one who lived in the apartment above. He was a young man her age, very reserved, to the point of seeming somewhat sinister. He never spoke to any of the neighbors and didn't leave the house much either. Whenever you crossed paths with him, he looked at you with suspicion, and she never actually heard his voice. The worst part was when she discovered that even though the neighbors weren't loud, the walls were so thin that you could hear practically everything. At that time, she combined classes with her first job to be able to afford the rent, and many nights she spent studying in her room. She tried to overcome sleep and concentrate, but the same thing always happened. Late at night, a series of annoying sounds began coming from the apartment above. knocks that repeated over and over as if someone was hitting the floor. They were light, constant. They reminded her of the noise women's heels make when walking. The most curious thing was that, besides always starting after midnight, they seemed to have a defined pattern, following a specific rhythm, to such a point that the young woman came to memorize the exact number of knocks and the intervals in which they occurred. With that on top of everything, it became very difficult for her to concentrate. In fact, she was about to go crazy. Sometimes she wondered if her weirdo neighbor made that noise every night on purpose to annoy her. She had never liked him, but because of the way he looked, she didn't dare confront him or complain either. She was genuinely afraid of how he might react. She seriously thought about moving, but with the little money she earned, it was difficult to find an alternative in the city. For a whole year, she had to endure that torture. Awake until all hours of the night trying to study, listening to that incessant series of little knocks that were burned into her brain. Luckily, she was able to pull her grades up and found a better paying job. Finally, she was able to move to an apartment downtown and say goodbye to that sinister torture. Years passed, and Martha graduated and ended up forming her own family. But one day, a chance event reminded her of her sinister neighbor and left her completely in shock. She was helping her little daughter do homework. At school, they were teaching them Morse code, and suddenly the girl started hitting the table with her knuckles, reproducing a sequence that immediately woke up old memories for Martha. It was the same sound she used to hear in her single apartment, and a shiver ran down her back. Immediately, she asked the little girl what that meant. She explained that it was the easiest and most fundamental code of all SOS, a desperate signal to ask for help. Martha froze. Since then, doubts assault her every time she thinks about it, especially at night. Who was asking for help and why? Stow R11. The white cat I remember the night I turned 14. We were waiting for my father to come home. My mother and I were sitting by the fireplace chatting and watching to make sure the dinner stayed warm on the fire. Finally, we heard his voice and his energetic knocks on the door, and my mother got up to open it for him. My father looked depressed, pale, and sad. He approached the fireplace, sat on a stool, and rested his hands on his knees. My mother was nervous and asked him if something had happened to him. At that moment, he looked at her with sorrow and said, "I'm not going to beat around the bush with you. Honey, I might have little time left. I saw the white cat." My mother suddenly went pale and crossed herself. Afterward, trying to recover, she asked him if he was joking. My father assured her he wouldn't joke about something like that. He had seen a large white cat with green eyes and an arched back like a bridge. My father finished his story in a low voice, staring into the fire. My mother had given in to panic and started praying. I was also terribly scared and wanted to cry because I knew what the appearance of the white cat meant. The reason my father had that terrible premonition was because all the members of my family who had received a similar encounter died shortly after, as if it were a warning of their imminent death. That prophecy had never failed, and it didn't fail that time either. A week later, my father fell ill with a high fever and died before a month had passed. This curse has been associated with my family for 80 years now. I spoke a long time ago with elderly relatives who vividly remembered everything related to this case. It happened as follows. My great-uncle was, at that time, the owner of the old Drangle farm. He was rich, but money doesn't soften a hard heart, and unfortunately, he was a cruel man. At that time, a pretty girl lived in the mountains. Her family wasn't wealthy, but she was so beautiful that many men were interested in being her partner, as was my great-uncle. He fell in love, but ultimately treated her badly. He promised her she would be his wife and convinced her to go with him. However, later he got tired of her and ended up marrying a young woman who had a large fortune. In this way, he became even richer, and his former partner died with a broken heart. One night he was returning home after a fair. When he was arriving at the farm, he saw something white sliding slowly across the ground, moving quickly and disappearing into the darkness. He had to pass next to some oak branches, but at that moment the horse stopped dead. My great-uncle yelled at it and got down to lead it by the reins, but the animal recoiled. He mounted it again, He was very angry at the animal's resistance and used the whip viciously. Suddenly, the horse started moving, and my great-uncle, passing under the oak branches, clearly saw a woman next to him with her arm extended. As he passed by her side, she gave him a strong blow on the back that made him hit his head on the horse's neck. The terrified animal arrived running at the door of the man's house. More dead than alive, my great-uncle entered. He told his story but assured everyone he hadn't recognized the woman's face. However, when he spoke with the priest, he told him it was the ghost of his ex-partner whom he had abandoned and who had died of grief. From that moment on, my great-uncle never recovered, and shortly after he died. At the wake, the corpse was placed in a small room. Afterward, they left him alone while making preparations to bury him. Upon approaching the bed, one of the maids ran out of the room with a scream. She said the man had his head raised and was staring at the door with open eyes. One of the farm workers accused her of being crazy. Another told her it had been her imagination upon entering the dark room. However, the maid knew very well what she had seen. An old woman in the family asked for a candle so she could check what was happening herself. The old woman began to pray as fast as her lips allowed and led the group with the candle in her hands. The woman hadn't advanced more than a few steps when she stopped dead. There was a white cat on the corpse's chest. She asked everyone who had let it in and whose it was, but no one answered. It wasn't a house cat, nor had anyone ever seen it. Suddenly, the cat positioned itself on the cushion next to the corpse's head, and after casting a look at everyone present, went sliding slowly along the body, meowing slowly but ferociously as it approached. Everyone ran out of the room terrified, closing the door tight behind them. During the 2 days they held the wake at the house, every time someone entered the room, the cat was on top of the corpse. It didn't matter what precautions they took, nor how many times they threw it out of there. The animal appeared again accompanying the deceased. From that moment, the white cat appears to my family when someone is about to die. It's as if it were the messenger of death. We believe it is the ghost of my great-uncle's ex-girlfriend taking that form when she shows up. Every member of our family who dies at Drangle sees the white cat beforehand and knows they have few days of life left. I'm not sure, but I think I saw a white tail around my house. Who is it looking for this time? Story 12, Nosferatu. When we talk about vampires, the first image that comes to mind is Count Dracula, but he isn't the only famous one. Nosferatu was so terrifying that when a movie about him was released in 1922, it was censored and destroyed. Experts consider him the most feared vampire of all time, and you are about to learn why. This happened in the 19th century. Thomas Hutter had already said goodbye to his wife Helen, and was on his way to the Carpathian Mountains. He had to reach the castle in Transylvania where Count Orlok lived. He had heard thousands of frightening stories about him, but Hutter didn't pay them any mind. He was going to close one of the best deals he'd ever had and was convinced those legends were lies. His coachman refused to cross the bridge that led to the dark castle. It could be seen in the distance on one of the most hidden peaks, looking neglected and shrouded in shadows. But after getting out of the carriage, a figure in a driver's suit appeared from the other end of the road. He claimed to be the Count's official chauffeur and offered to take him up the steep slope. When he arrived, he was received by Orlok himself, who claimed that since it was midnight, all his servants had gone to bed. He had seen his face before but didn't know where. They dined together discussing Orlok's desire to buy a house in the city of Wisborg, Germany. Hutter grabbed the bread to cut a piece, but he was so obsessed thinking about the money he was going to earn after making that sale that, in a moment of distraction, the knife slipped, slicing his hand. The Count, out of control upon seeing the blood, lunged to drink from his guest's wound until he fainted. Hutter woke up the next day with 2 bite marks on his neck. Remembering nothing, he thought it had been a mosquito. He looked for Orlok all over the castle until he entered his chambers. There was no one there, but looking through his things, he found the Book of Vampires. At that instant, he understood the situation. He was trapped in that castle with a monster. He knew vampires slept during the day, and there was only an hour left until nightfall. The entrance gate was locked, so he tried to look for an exit from the basement. He had to hurry, or he would be in trouble. It looked like a labyrinth. He entered a room where there were several coffins, and rats that were everywhere started making a very unpleasant noise. He didn't have time to analyze the situation when one of the coffins began to open, and instinctively he hid in the nearest casket. The coffin was full of dirt, and there were rodents shut in with him running up and down his body. He had to suppress the urge to get out. That creature coming out of the other coffin was the Count himself. The legends were right, and he was in danger. He fell asleep before the next sunrise, and when he opened his eyes, he noticed he was moving. He slightly opened the lid of that box and saw he was on a ship with the other coffins, destination unknown. The screams took little time to appear. The Count was murdering the entire crew. Orlok only left the captain alive to take him to port. Hutter recognized that city, Stockholm. He waited for the ship to dock and unload the coffins to run out. Upon his arrival, Count Orlok, known as Nosferatu, infested the city with the rats sleeping in his coffins. That plague is known today as the third pandemic of bubonic plague. STOR 13. Hide and seek. It can't be denied that people are naturally suspicious. When in doubt, we often tend to think the worst of others, even if they are our closest loved ones. This is the story of a man who distrusted his great love, and it brought him terrible consequences. It happened at the beginning of the last century, when customs were different, especially for romantic relationships. And the higher the social class, the more restrictive everything was. Young nobles courted ladies politely, always with their family's permission. They couldn't have dates alone, it was immoral, and would immediately raise rumors among the people. They had to wait to be married to have their own intimacy. Matilda and Alan had known each other since childhood. Their families owned large farmlands and maintained a friendship spanning several generations. When people saw them playing as kids, their circle already destined a future together for them, uniting the wealth of both houses. So, it was natural that between the proximity and pressure from their parents, they ended up becoming a couple and getting engaged. However, as in all arranged marriages, both had their doubts. Alan distrusted Matilda's character. He felt he didn't know her true self, only her exterior facade. He tried to get close to her and find a moment to be alone, but she was very modest and always avoided him. One night, shortly before the wedding, Alan came up with the perfect excuse. They would use an old unoccupied mansion he owned to organize a big party with all their friends and celebrate the engagement. That way, away from the family, maybe he would finally have his chance. But the night started badly, and during dinner, Matilda busied herself more with attending to her guests than being with him. After this, everyone gathered in the grand main hall to look for some entertainment. The young people were very animated, and Matilda innocently proposed playing hide and seek. The idea was a hit, and she chose Alan as the first one in charge of searching for the others. He immediately understood her plan. If he was able to find her, they could finally be alone. The guests dispersed through the house while the groom counted in a corner and set out to find them. One by one, he found all the people, who returned to the salon to continue having fun. But when midnight arrived, after scouring the entire house, all the participants had appeared except one. Matilda wasn't anywhere. Alan, worried, gave up and asked the others for help finding her. They turned the mansion upside down, checking every nook and cranny from the basement to the attic. But it was useless. No one found the bride. The search extended to the surrounding areas, and Alan's fear turned into anger when people started speculating that the bride had run away. Suddenly, everything made sense in his mind. Matilda had regretted the wedding, and taking advantage of that night away from the family, proposed the game to escape far from him. She had left him stranded like a dog with the general humiliation that implied. The next day, still with no news of the girl, the marriage was canceled, and Alan didn't want to hear about her ever again. Matilda was never heard from again, although there were some who said they had seen her fleeing in the middle of the night in the company of another man. The spurned young man didn't take long to get engaged again to another lady from a good family, and after a year, they married. Despite Alan's reluctance, they decided to go live in the family mansion where it all happened. While the servants cleaned everything and prepared the home for the newlyweds, one of the maids found an old trunk in one of the most remote rooms that seemed to have been closed for years. She looked for the key to open it and check what it held, and upon lifting the lid, her scream of terror resonated through the whole house. Everyone arrived running to discover, horrified, that inside the trunk lay the lifeless body of a woman with gnawed clothes and decomposing flesh. By the dress, Alan knew immediately who it was. It was Matilda, the same woman he had cursed that fateful night while she was locked inside, unable to get out. Stoar 14, conjoined twins out of 50,000 twins, 2 are born with some part joined. Chloe and Amy were part of that reduced number. The doctors said they couldn't separate them, as they shared too many vital organs. But their father didn't want to have a rare freak as a descendant, nor have people stare at him when walking down the street with them. He locked them in the basement under lock and key for their first 9 years. They threw food at them from the door as if they were beasts without feelings. So, one day they decided to escape. They waited for lunchtime to arrive, and when their father opened the door, they tried to run. The only thing they achieved was getting pushed down the stairs and insulted. They were desperate. What had they done to deserve this? On their 9th birthday, he told them, "I have a special gift for you. Tomorrow you're getting out of here." They felt enormous happiness. They spent the whole night imagining what the outside world would be like. But the worst was yet to come. First, he forced them to put on handcuffs and a muzzle and get into a box. He sealed it from the top with duct tape. They were in there for a good while, not knowing where he was taking them. Suddenly, a knife pierced the cardboard. A ray of light indicated it was time to see the outside, but upon coming out, they realized they weren't going to be free. They were locked in a cage. On the other side was a man dressed in a white coat taking notes in a notebook. He went toward them and took off the muzzle. When they asked him for help, he started laughing. He ordered them to calm down and explained he was a scientist. He said he was going to do some experiments with them and promised he would let them go if they survived. Suddenly, he took out a needle and pricked Amy to know if Chloe also felt pain. Afterward, he brought a tub full of water and ice and put Chloe in. He wanted to see if the other sister's body temperature changed. Chloe wouldn't stop screaming in pain. "Get me out of here! Get me out, please!" After a week of several more tests, he commented that the time had come to separate them. Although they objected, he cornered them in a corner of the cage and stuck them with a syringe. The sisters fell into a deep sleep. Upon waking up, they were chained to a long table. They saw the sharp saw approaching them. There was blood everywhere. Amy woke up in a hospital after months in a coma. Only she had survived because the heart was on her side. Stoar 15. The exorcism today will tell you the story of Mike, a young man who hasn't been the same since living the story you are about to discover. Mike was a quiet boy, the typical stereotype of an obedient young man who never gets into trouble. That son every parent wishes to have. His best friend, Lily, who was also his neighbor, was the complete opposite. She swore. She snuck out of the house to be with her friend. She was disobedient. However, with Mike, she behaved very differently. She was sweet and affectionate. She faced down anyone who picked on him to defend him and helped him with whatever he needed. Both were in love, but neither was capable of taking the step. In recent weeks, Lily had had a lot of problems with her parents. They were very devout and had punished her numerous times for having behaviors that their God didn't like. To Mike, Lily's family was like a cult. They only wanted to associate with people akin to their beliefs, and all those who thought differently were sinners. His friend's situation worsened even more when, in a heated argument, she yelled horrible things at her parents, at least horrible to them. In short, ignoring the swear words and insults, she said she didn't believe in any God and spat on the Bible in front of them. Mike could hear the screams from his house. He peeked out the window to try to see something, but he had no luck. He decided to go out to the garden to wait for his friend. After being punished, she always escaped through the guest room window. He waited several hours, but she was still inside. Suddenly, he saw a priest knocking on his neighbor's door. It wasn't the town priest. He hadn't seen him before. Her mother opened the door and invited him in. The screams in his friend's house started getting louder and louder. She wasn't just screaming anymore, now she was crying inconsolably. Mike was desperate. He didn't know how to help her. If he rang the bell, her parents wouldn't let him in. To them, he was a heretic putting bad thoughts in their daughter's head. But she kept screaming. He thought about calling the police, but he had to have proof that they were actually doing something bad to her. Were they hurting her? How was a priest going to participate in hitting a girl? Suddenly, he had an idea. He remembered the guest room window. He jumped the wall that separated both gardens and tried opening the window. Lily had left it open. He jumped inside very carefully and tiptoed up to the door to listen better. His friend was screaming with heartbreaking force. She shrieked, "Let me go! You have no right to do this to me! Let me go!" At the same time, the priest and her parents recited verses that sounded like prayers. It finally dawned on Mike what they were doing to her. They were performing an exorcism ritual. Mike came out of his hiding place and entered the room where his friend was. Lily was tied to the bed with ropes and her eyes were rolled back. The priest showed her the crucifix while relentlessly spraying her with holy water. Lily's mother turned at Mike's presence. She grabbed him by the ears and shoved him to the front door. "Look what we have to do to her because of you," she told him, gritting her teeth. Lily and her family moved a few days later. Mike never saw his friend again. He didn't receive a letter or any call. He didn't even know if she was actually still alive. Stuar 16. The Tama were traveling to the ruins of ancient Egypt to discover the secrets and dangers hidden there. Sarah was the best archaeologist in her country. She had a great career at her young age. She had made discoveries worthy of awards and worked her fingers to the bone on every excavation. No mystery could resist her. She was called to attend the exploration of an Egyptian tomb discovered during the construction of the new museum in Cairo. The world knew it was facing a historic event. When the day came, she went down to the excavation leading her team. They were surprised not to have run into any traps. They spotted a crossroads that reminded them a lot of the route leading to Tum KV-62, where Tutankhamun was buried. They decided to follow the same route until they found a door sealed with a thick rope. Sarah took out the knife she always carried and cut it. She grabbed the knob and pulled slowly in case there was any danger. The room remained completely dark, even though the torchlight illuminated it. One of her colleagues took the initiative to enter first, but upon putting a foot inside that room, something crunched under the sole of his shoe. Suddenly, a strong avalanche of black beetles lunged at them. When that storm of insects ceased, they could see the floor and the solid gold walls of that chamber. After making sure there were no traps, they approached the sarcophagus. Upon lifting the lid, a cloud of ash began to sprout from the interior. It ended up enveloping the whole room, and it became impossible to breathe. Luckily, Sarah always carried her gas mask in her backpack. She saw her colleagues falling to the floor one by one. Breathing that substance burned their lungs. She was the only survivor. She managed to return to the surface with the little strength she had left after having breathed some ash. She lost consciousness as soon as she got out and had to be hospitalized. It took her several days to wake up. When she opened her eyes, she coughed nonstop until what appeared to be a beetle leg came out of her throat. The doctors decided to keep her admitted. Her body temperature was touching 104 degrees. One day, her skin started to itch, and upon scratching her leg, she heard a crunch. She had a strange lump on it. The itching spread everywhere, and every time she scratched, something crunched inside her body. She made a great effort to lift her head and look at herself. Something wasn't right. Small lumps covered her from top to bottom. It seemed like they were moving. She felt something move inside her forehead to the top of her head. Then, a strong pain made her call desperately for the nurses before losing consciousness. She died during the operation. The doctors found baby beetles all over her body. While they were entering the tomb, one of the insects had placed eggs under her skin. According to the autopsy, one of the hatchlings devoured her brain from the inside. STORY 17. EVP, as you know, there are many lovers of the paranormal. Like you, they enjoy fear and inexplicable events. Luke was like that, and this is his story. His parents instilled interest in these topics in him. Since he was little, they read him scary stories before sleep, and far from getting scared, he adored that time of day. They also used to escape to the forest or gloomy places. It was something so natural that he never stopped to think it could have consequences. When he became an adult, his interest came and went. He spent seasons reading many books or watching horror series, and others where he forgot about the subject. He got a job as an accountant, and although he didn't love it, it allowed him to live well, and he was able to buy his own apartment. Little by little, he decorated it until he could move in. Then he became a fan of a TV show in which several investigators explored dark places in search of spirits. His favorite part was the electronic voice phenomenon, or EVP, when investigators record themselves asking questions in an empty room. Later, when listening to them, they heard voices that hadn't been perceived in the moment. And precisely while watching one of those programs, Luke had the idea to buy a digital recorder. Absorbed in the daily grind, he forgot about the matter until the delivery driver knocked on his door with his new acquisition. That same night, he tested it. After reading from top to bottom how to carry out the ritual, he stayed up until well into the early morning asking questions to the air. With the first rays of sun, he decided to rest a while. Upon waking up, the first thing he did was listen to the recording. He had seen many programs and thought many of them were faked, so he did it with little hope of finding anything interesting. Without realizing it, Luke had left the device recording while he slept. When he knew, it amused him to think they would simply hear his snoring, but he found more in that recording than he expected. He rewound to a random point and started listening. In the first 30 seconds, there was nothing, but then he perceived the sound of sheets moving. He sharpened his hearing. He heard a voice, too. After listening to it several times, he deciphered it. It said, "I see you." He was totally in shock. His head wouldn't stop spinning. He thought about whether he had talked in his sleep, but that voice didn't sound like his. He kept listening for hours and distinguished 4 more phrases. "He's there. Watch him. I see you. And you can't escape." He threw the recorder on the bed, very scared. What was it that he had just heard? He couldn't find any sense in it, but he needed to verify it again. See if those voices were still there one more night. So he went to sleep early and left the device recording again. He woke up at 2 in the morning with a tremendous sense of danger. He threw the following question into the air: "Is there anyone with me?" He didn't receive an answer, and although it was hard for him, he managed to fall asleep again. In the morning, he checked the recording, and the first thing he heard scared him. It was his door opening. He was sure he had locked it, but the sound left no room for doubt. Someone had opened it. After that came the first voice. "He's there." The next one was worse. It was still audible. "Kill him now." And immediately after, he himself asking if there was anyone in the room. The worst part of all is that his question also had an answer. 50 of us are here. At that point, he was totally terrified. The following week, he put his house up for sale and moved. Since then, Luke constantly feels like he's being watched and has a very hard time resting. His advice is that you never record yourself while sleeping. StuRB 18. The Bunny Man. A few years ago, in a lost town, a satanic ritual was performed, but on this occasion it was done differently. A rabbit was beheaded instead of a goat. With its blood, a small circle was drawn on the ground surrounding a wooden crucifix. To finish, the dead animal was placed in the center over the cross, and they intoned a chant we won't reveal for your safety. These were the steps detailed in his last book by the shaman they were trying to revive. In life, he had achieved miracles like curing blindness and the strangest diseases. However, the result wasn't what was expected. After an enormous flare, the rabbit disappeared from the circle. They didn't want to give up, and they sacrificed 10 more rabbits to make a pact with the devil, but they achieved nothing. The following days, all those who performed the ritual were brutally murdered, and all in the same way their throats had been cut. It seemed this event hadn't had any consequence until Linda and her group of friends decided to go to a house in the country. They wanted to celebrate finishing exams. They had spent a few months barely going out and needed a night to disconnect. After a long car trip, they arrived at their destination. The dwelling was bigger than it looked in the photos. There was a man waiting for them there to give them the keys, as they had discussed. For them, the best thing about that place was that there was no cell service. Their decision had been to disconnect, and this way they were forced to do it 100%. They told their families not to worry and not to call them. They would do it when they returned. They ate and played cards. A few hours later, they decided to go to the pool. They spent an unforgettable afternoon full of laughter, and best of all, just among themselves, without electronic devices in the way. It had gotten late, and they made dinner. They put the charcoal they had bought in a barbecue. They had all kinds of meat, pork, chicken, sausages, and rabbit. Since it was going to take a while to cook, they left the food on the grill and gathered in the living room to talk and hang out. But upon returning, they observed that the rabbit meat had disappeared. Not only what was cooking, but also what was in the bag. They didn't give it much importance, since in the country any hungry animal could have taken it. Just in case, they stayed close to the barbecue and made the rest. They had dinner, although they were left a bit hungry. It was time to start the party and go to bed late. They had to take advantage of the opportunity. After a few hours, one of them commented that he had seen something move through the window. He thought it had been the animal that took their food, so he grabbed a knife and went out in search of it. His intention was to hunt it and eat it as a lesson. Besides, there was still charcoal left. But after 5 minutes, a scream of pain was heard. Everyone was sure it was their friend's voice, and they quickly went to look for him. They found nothing more than small blood stains on the garden floor. Scared, they locked themselves in the house. Shortly after, someone knocked on the door, and they opened it quickly. They were surprised to see that the one who had arrived wasn't their friend, but a rabbit the height of a human, with red eyes and a scar on its neck. He had something in his hand that couldn't be seen well because of the darkness. It was the young man's head with an expression of panic, still dripping blood. The friends stood in shock, trying to process what they were seeing. Then they closed quickly and grabbed whatever tools they found to use as weapons and knives, fireplace tongs, and pointy bars that were lying in a room. They spent the whole night scared. Even though there was no service, they made several attempts to call the police. The phones didn't even ring. They were alone in the face of danger. They couldn't sleep, and at every noise they heard, they turned around alarmed with weapons raised. They just trembled and cried. They felt unprotected, even though they had the numbers advantage. In a moment of bravery, they looked through the windows, and taking advantage of the fact that no one was there, they got in the car and left quickly. They wanted to reach the police station and report what had happened to their friend. They were so afraid they couldn't even talk to each other. They dedicated themselves to staring into infinity and trembling. On a curve, one of the tires punctured, and the car went off the road. Luckily, the fall was very slight, and no one was hurt. However, the auto had flipped, and now they were completely defenseless and unarmed. Try as they might, it was impossible to flip the vehicle. Plus, they didn't have a spare tire. They could only pray hoping someone would pass by that lost road and give them a hand. Suddenly, they spotted 2 red eyes in the darkness. They turned on their phone lights and saw the figure of the rabbit. This time he was covered in blood and wielding a machete. The young people tried to run, but their legs didn't respond from fear. Those who managed to get away didn't take long to collapse from panic. They knew they were lost. They screamed for help. However, they were so far from civilization that while doing it, they knew it was useless. The rabbit approached slowly, showing a brilliant smile that dazzled in the flashlight beams. Several days later, a family heading to the same house found the overturned car. The smell was so unbearable that they tracked the area a bit to find the cause and came upon the bodies. Everyone had their throats cut. They returned quickly and alerted the police. They didn't find any culprit or suspect other than the owner of that house, whom they interrogated on different occasions. There was only one common element. Besides the fact that they had been cruelly butchered, the clothes they wore had something grayish that they sent to analyze. Rabbit fur. Several people claim to have seen that strange subject in different parts of the world, totally separated and without any connection, with only one common factor: a rabbit had been harmed. STR 19. The bunk bed were traveling to Carson City, the capital of Nevada, to learn a terrifying story that took place on the eve of Epiphany in 2012, when Mike was 9 years old. That year, everything was going to be different. It was the first Christmas they hadn't spent with his brother because of that accident 3 months ago. They had a tradition. Since the brother was the oldest and slept on the bottom bunk, on the night of the Three Kings, he would wake up first and be in charge of waking Mike up to open gifts together. There were still 24 hours left for that moment, but the family could feel the sadness that one was missing. Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve were horrendous. They didn't even eat with their relatives. The mother, the father, and Mike stayed home without celebrating anything. He got up early and started doing homework. The next day he was going to be playing with gifts, so it was better to get it done. When he finished, he felt so tired that he waited anxiously for lunchtime to take a nap. When he got up, it was already 9 at night, so he figured he would barely sleep. However, he was wrong. He had dinner around 10:30 and went to bed at 11. Lying in bed, he reflected that this year he hadn't asked for anything special. He simply didn't feel like he needed anything. He just wanted his brother back. He spent about 2 hours thinking about the past. He remembered these same dates in previous years when excitement overflowed the house. They both got up as early as possible to open the gifts they had asked for while their father recorded them from a corner of the living room so they could see it when they grew up. He fell asleep without realizing it. He had some very strange dreams. Mike was fully conscious of everything he did and could even decide what to do and choose the words to use. Then he visualized a silhouette he couldn't recognize in the distance. It began to approach. It seemed he was in a kind of room sitting on the bottom part of a bunk bed. He couldn't believe it. It was his brother. It seemed too real. The brother looked at Mike and asked him about his life during the months they hadn't seen each other. He couldn't tell him anything special. Then he asked if he wanted to go with him. He didn't understand at first. Go where? When he tried to realize what was happening, his brother wasn't in front of him anymore. It was a monstrous face, pale with half the face disfigured and one eye totally covered by wrinkled skin. Mike woke up trembling from the cold, sweating, and with his heart racing. He didn't know what time it was and looked at the clock on the table opposite his bed. 6 in the morning. He thought that would be the time he would normally wake up to open presents. Then he heard a voice asking him if he was awake. It was his brother. He answered yes, still half asleep. Maybe he didn't quite understand the situation. The voice told him, "Mike, look down." Without being conscious of it, he looked at the bed below and found himself face to face with that face from the dream, exactly the same, coming toward him. He couldn't hold back a scream that woke his parents, who came running into the room and turned on the light. After asking him what happened, they tried to calm him down, saying it had been a simple nightmare. His mother told him to go down to have breakfast and open his gifts. When they left the light on. Mike decided to get down from the bed, still trembling, and that was when he noticed his brother's bed was still unmade. To what extent had it been a dream? STOR 20. The reflection, it was her first day at the new high school. She crossed the entrance door with 1,000 eyes on her back, but she was very sure of herself. So, stepping strong, she crossed the long hallway that took her to her class. The others looked at her curiously. No one from outside the town had gone to that center for years. Helen had moved to town that summer. Her father was a bank manager, and after a restructuring in his company, they had assigned him a job 140 miles from his house. In general, the transfer hadn't sat very well with the family, who had been living in the same house for more than 20 years. In contrast, Helen was happy. She liked challenges. It was her senior year, and she would have to strive double to get good grades. And she was sure she'd achieve it. She wanted to be a computer engineer to create video games. That was her other great passion. That's why she walked so decisively into class. She was sure of herself and wasn't afraid of anything. Her classmates watched her and whispered, but she already expected that. So she entered, sat in the front row, and waited patiently for the teacher to come in. Everyone knew each other. The town was small, so most had been studying together their whole lives. That's why, shortly after starting, the teacher asked Helen to introduce herself. She, without hesitating, stood up, said her name, and explained the reason for her move. After that, the teacher started the class without further ado. At first, no classmate approached her. She wasn't worried, but she got bored during breaks, so she tried to approach a couple of girls who seemed nice. They were polite and answered her questions, but when they saw an opportunity, they escaped. So she started spending breaks in the computer lab. There, she found a kind of private booth where she could have fun with her video games or study. No one bothered her. Sometimes she even took the chance to do her homework. That way she got ahead on housework and had the afternoon free to do other things. Days passed, and her routine took hold. Her classmates still didn't integrate her, but she already had her old friends, and now she had found a pastime for dead hours, so she didn't care. It seemed strange to her that despite being very well equipped, practically no one went to that classroom. Some student would come to print papers, but they were never there more than 5 or 10 minutes. She wanted to ask them, but since none approached her, she decided not to. One afternoon, while she was playing Minecraft, she thought she saw reflected in the screen 2 girls who seemed to be at the back of the class. She turned quickly, but she didn't see anyone and regretted having gotten distracted. She had lost the game, but the story repeated itself in the following days. If it wasn't the screen, it was her hand mirror. If not the mirror, it was a window pane. Those 2 girls appeared constantly. They were so alike that Helen immediately deduced they were twins, but they were only in her imagination. She had never believed in anything paranormal, but she was starting to get scared. It had been several days believing she saw the same thing. That distracted her from her studies. She couldn't sleep and needed to find answers. She wanted to approach one of her classmates. But as soon as she mentioned the subject, they left and didn't answer her questions. She also stopped going to the computer lab. She spent breaks sitting on a bench on the patio. No one approached her, and she was very bored, but she hadn't found another way out. Upon stopping going there, she also stopped seeing those 2 girls for a few days, but the nightmare hadn't ended. One night she dreamed she was washing her face in the bathroom, and they appeared in the mirror. With barely any time to react, one held her hands and set fire to the curtains. They managed to kill her, but just at the last moment, she woke up and checked that it was simply a dream. That night she couldn't sleep anymore. She was afraid to close her eyes and see them again. Her parents started to worry. She had dark circles under her eyes, was always sad, and her grades were dropping. She decided she couldn't go on like this, so she started investigating tragic events involving twins, and without much effort, she found them. On the second web page she consulted, she was able to recognize them. It was them, the same ones she had seen in that classroom. The news said they had passed away in a fire at the school 70 years ago. It had been a traumatic event that shocked an entire generation. The case was relatively recent, and although at that moment she knew who it was, she didn't understand why she could see them. Finding that answer took her more time, and they were really complicated weeks. The twins had snuck into her dreams. She could no longer sleep or do anything else. In school, the rumor spread that she was possessed, and her classmates moved away from her as if she had the plague. And since the town was small, it didn't take long for the priest to appear either. He showed up one night at her house telling her parents that Helen needed an exorcism, otherwise she would die. He told her she had invaded the space of 2 souls and now they wanted her dead. Her parents fought tooth and nail, but deep down they didn't know what to do with what was happening to them. They visited several psychologists and psychiatrists, but nothing worked. And things got worse. By not sleeping, Helen started having hallucinations. The few times she closed her eyes, she did really weird things. She walked through the house saying strange things. She lay on the floor or broke different objects. She was totally desperate. So she decided she was going to return to that classroom. She took advantage of the end of classes to sneak in there. She sat in a chair and waited to see them again. They didn't take long to appear, and then she confronted them. She asked them what they wanted from her, why they were following her, but no one answered, and suddenly it started smelling like burning. She looked to the sides, and one of the computers was smoking. Soon the flames started. She got very scared, so she quickly headed to the door to ask for help, but she didn't manage to open it. It was completely blocked. The smoke soon began to flood everything, and she was losing consciousness little by little. She fainted while listening to the fire alarm. The firefighters managed to rescue her with significant burns on 50% of her body. No one could explain the cause of the fire, although in reality everyone knew what had happened. Helen managed to recover from her physical wounds, but never the psychological ones. She stopped seeing the twins, but her parents left town, and the computer lab remained closed forever.